The call that changed everything. The city outside shimmered beneath the morning sun, its glass towers reflecting a world that never slowed down, not even for those who gave it their best years. Inside a quiet Los Angeles apartment, Sandra Bullock sat by her window, her hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee she hadn't touched in hours. The world knew her as a woman of grace and laughter, the silver screen star whose smile could light up a room, but lately, the reflection in her mirror showed something else. Fatigue, the kind that no makeup could hide. She had finished filming a long emotional drama weeks ago, and since then, she had felt an ache in her chest that refused to leave. At first, she blamed exhaustion. Hollywood expected perfection, and perfection often demanded silence about one's pain. But that morning, when her phone buzzed with a reminder for her checkup, something inside whispered that this time she shouldn't postpone it. Across town, Keanu Reeves was on his way to a quiet cafe he and Sandra used to visit after long shoots. They had been friends for decades, not lovers as the tabloids always speculated, but souls who understood one another's quiet battles. Keanu had always admired how she carried her kindness like armor, even in a world that fed on judgment. He'd been meaning to call her, to check if she was okay, but every time he picked up the phone, work or silence got in the way. That day, as he sat by the window of the cafe, sipping black coffee, he caught himself staring at the empty chair across from him, the one she always occupied, laughing about something simple, making ordinary moments feel sacred. A faint sadness settled over him. He didn't know why, but something in the air felt off, like the world had paused to hold its breath. Meanwhile, Sandra sat in the hospital's waiting room, the smell of disinfectant and echoes of hurried footsteps filling the air. Her assistant had begged to come with her, but she insisted on going alone. She didn't want anyone to see her vulnerable. For years, she had been everyone's source of strength. A mother, a friend, a symbol of resilience. But now she was afraid of what the doctor might say. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the sleeve of her sweater, hiding the small tremor that had started a few days ago. When the nurse called her name, she stood up slowly, feeling the weight of years on her shoulders. The years she'd spent being strong for everyone else. The doctor's voice was calm, but heavy. The kind that tried to soften the impact of the truth. "We need to run a few more tests, Ms. Bullock. There's an irregularity in your heart rhythm." Sandra smiled politely, as if she had heard a simple inconvenience. But inside, the words echoed with quiet terror. She thought of her children, of unfinished scripts, of the laughter she still wanted to share. She wanted to believe it was just stress, that she could rest for a few days, and everything would go back to normal. Yet as she stood to leave the consultation room, her vision blurred for a second. The nurse rushed forward, but before anyone could reach her, Sandra's knees gave way, and she collapsed onto the cold hospital floor. The last thing she heard was someone shouting her name as the world faded to grey. When Keanu received the call, he was in the middle of a meeting about a charity foundation he had quietly funded, one that provided scholarships to underprivileged kids in memory of his late girlfriend. His phone buzzed, and he almost ignored it until he saw the caller ID, Sandra's assistant. The voice on the other end trembled as she said the words that made his world stop. "Keanu, it's Sandra." She collapsed. "They've taken her into surgery." For a moment, everything around him, the papers, the voices, the plans, dissolved into silence. He didn't say a word. He simply grabbed his keys, walked out of the building, and drove like a man possessed. The hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic and fear. Keanu arrived breathless, his cap pulled low, trying to avoid recognition. But the nurses knew him. They could see the panic in his eyes that no fame could disguise. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. The nurse led him toward the ICU, where the faint beeping of machines marked the fragile rhythm of life. Through the glass he saw her, pale, still, a world away from the vibrant woman he had always known. The sight broke something inside him. He pressed his palm against the glass, his reflection overlapping with hers, and whispered under his breath, "Don't you dare leave." Hours passed. The doctors moved around with quiet urgency, their faces unreadable. Keanu sat on the hallway bench, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. For once, the man known for his calm composure looked lost. Memories flooded his mind, their first movie together, the long talks between takes, the way she once told him that kindness was the only thing that made fame bearable. She had always been the strong one, the light in every dark room. Seeing her like this felt unreal, cruel, undeserved. A nurse walked over to him and softly placed a hand on his shoulder. "She's stable now," she said, "but she needs rest. Her heart's under stress." He nodded, but his heart refused to believe that everything was fine. He knew her well enough to understand. Sandra didn't collapse over nothing. When they finally allowed him to see her, the room was quiet except for the rhythmic hum of the machines. She looked fragile, her face drained of color, her hand resting near the edge of the bed. He sat beside her and gently took her hand, whispering, "You once told me that pain teaches us who we are." "Well, I think we've learned enough, Sandy. Wake up, okay?" The words trembled out of him like a prayer he didn't know how to say aloud. He stayed there through the night, ignoring the messages from his agent, the phone calls, the world outside that wanted something from him. All that mattered was her, the woman who once taught him that silence could be healing, that laughter was strength in disguise. By dawn, Sandra stirred. Her eyelids fluttered and her voice came out weak, barely a whisper. "You stayed?" she asked. Keanu smiled softly, eyes wet but steady. "Of course I did," he said. "You'd do the same for me." She tried to smile, but tears rolled down her cheeks instead. "I was so scared," she murmured. He squeezed her hand gently. "Me too," he admitted. "But you're still here. That's what matters." For a long time they sat in silence, the kind that speaks more than words ever could. As the morning light filled the room, the hospital staff whispered among themselves, astonished that Keanu Reeves had spent the entire night sitting beside Sandra Bullock like a quiet guardian. But for him, it wasn't about fame or headlines. It was about loyalty, about the rare bond that life gives only once or twice. When the doctor entered, he looked relieved. "You're lucky, Miss Bullock," he said. "You'll need some rest, but you're going to be fine." Sandra looked at Keanu, her voice soft but steady. "He's right," she said, "but only because I wasn't alone." Later that day, as he helped her sign the discharge papers, he realized how fragile everything truly was. The fame, the schedules, the constant chase for perfection. What mattered were moments like this. Being there when it counted, showing up when the world fell silent. When they stepped outside, the sky was bright and endless, and for the first time in months, Sandra felt light again. Keanu turned to her and said quietly, "You scared the hell out of me." She chuckled weakly, her voice carrying a trace of that old warmth. "Then I guess we're even," she replied. They walked together toward the parking lot, side by side, not saying much, and yet saying everything. And in that quiet space between breaths, both of them knew life had just handed them a second chance, not just to live, but to truly feel again. When silence spoke louder than words, the next morning, the hospital room was filled with a soft golden light that filtered through the half-drawn curtains. The air carried that faint, sterile chill, but somehow it felt warmer now, maybe because Sandra was awake, breathing, alive. Keanu sat quietly by her bedside, his back straight, but his eyes heavy from a sleepless night. A styrofoam cup of coffee sat untouched beside him, the steam long gone, forgotten just like everything else that wasn't her. He wasn't used to hospitals, to the smell of antiseptic or the constant buzz of monitors, yet he found a strange comfort in being there. The sound of her steady heartbeat through the monitor was all he needed to keep still, to remind himself that she was really okay. Sandra turned her head slowly toward him, her voice weak but still carrying that familiar mix of warmth and humor. "You're still here?" Most people would have escaped by now. Keanu smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes softening. "Most people don't get the chance to sit beside someone who means this much," he said. She blinked, surprised by the honesty in his tone, and looked away, trying to hide the tears that welled up again. For years, They had been bound by something unspoken, not romance, not friendship alone, but a deep connection that lived quietly between shared glances and gentle silences. They had been through fame together, through heartbreak, through loneliness that success couldn't cure. Yet this was different. This was fragile, human, and raw. Sandra felt a strange shame rise in her chest. She had always been the strong one, the one who kept it all together. But seeing him sitting there, his face lined with worry, made her realize how much she had taken that strength for granted. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "You have your own battles." Keanu shook his head slowly. "There's nothing more important than this." His words carried no drama, just truth. And that truth wrapped around her like a blanket in the cold. Hours passed, and nurses came and went, but Keanu barely moved. He answered every doctor's question, signed whatever needed signing, and stayed out of the way, quietly watching, listening, being present in that quiet way only he could. Sandra drifted in and out of sleep, and each time she opened her eyes, he was still there. It was as if he had made a silent promise to himself not to leave until she was strong enough to walk out of there. By evening, she whispered, "You know you don't have to play the hero." He leaned back in his chair, his voice soft but firm. "Heroes save people. I'm just keeping my promise." She frowned lightly. "What promise?" He looked at her then, his eyes dark and steady. "Years ago, when you told me you were tired of being everyone's rock, you said you just wanted someone who wouldn't leave when things got hard." I didn't forget. That night, when the city outside dimmed and the hospital lights cast long reflections on the floor, Keanu stayed by the window, watching the faint stars struggle through the haze of Los Angeles. The city never truly slept, but in that moment it felt like time itself had slowed down for them. He remembered their early days, two young actors standing under bright lights, laughing about their lines, trying to make sense of a world that expected perfection from broken souls. They had always leaned on humor to survive, but behind that humor lived scars that fame could never heal. Sandra's laughter had once saved him during his darkest years, after his tragic losses, after the silence that nearly swallowed him whole. She was the one who told him it was okay to smile again, to let kindness be louder than pain. And now, here he was, holding onto her hand as if the world would stop turning if he let go. When the nurse came in to change her IV, she smiled gently at Keanu. "You must be exhausted," she said softly. "Most people don't last 2 nights sitting here." Keanu just shook his head. "She's worth it," he murmured. The nurse nodded with quiet respect, not saying another word. Moments later, Sandra opened her eyes again, her voice barely audible. "You still talk like every word matters." Keanu smiled faintly. "Because it does." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was peaceful, filled with everything neither of them needed to say. As the days passed, Sandra's color began to return. The tests confirmed her condition wasn't fatal, but the doctors warned her that she had been pushing herself too hard for too long. "You've been living on stress," her physician told her. "Your body's strong, but even strong hearts break under pressure." The words hit her harder than she expected. She had built her entire life on the idea that strength meant never stopping, never showing weakness. But now, lying there, she realized how fragile she had become. Keanu watched her quietly as she processed the news, his hand resting gently on hers. "Maybe," he said, "this is life's way of telling you to slow down, to breathe again." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "You say that like you know," he nodded slowly. "Because I do. I've been where you are, empty, tired, pretending everything's fine. The trick isn't pretending less. It's learning to live softer." That sentence stayed with her. Learning to live softer. It rolled around in her mind long after he had stepped out to get her some water. She had always believed in resilience, in showing up no matter how much it hurt. But maybe he was right. Maybe the bravest thing wasn't to keep going at full speed, but to stop, to let yourself rest, to let others take care of you for once. When Keanu returned, she looked at him differently, not as a friend, not as a co-star, but as someone who had seen through every mask she'd ever worn. A few days later, she was discharged. The paparazzi had already caught wind of her collapse, and outside the hospital, flashes from cameras cut through the air like lightning. Keanu positioned himself beside her, shielding her from the chaos with quiet dignity. "Ignore them," he said softly. "Just breathe." She nodded, gripping his hand tightly as they walked to his car. The crowd shouted her name, desperate for a photo, a headline, a scandal, but all she cared about was the calm voice beside her, guiding her through the noise. When they finally got inside, she exhaled deeply, closing her eyes. "I hate this part of our lives," she muttered. Keanu started the engine slowly, looking ahead. "Then let's write a new one," he said. "No cameras, no noise, just life." He took her to a quiet cabin outside the city, a place he had kept hidden from the world, where the air was clean and the nights were filled with silence instead of sirens. It wasn't grand or luxurious, but it was peaceful, surrounded by trees that whispered in the wind. Sandra looked around, a small smile forming on her lips. "You've been hiding this from me all these years?" she asked softly. Keanu chuckled. "Some things are meant to stay secret until the right moment." She sank into a chair by the window, the first real smile touching her face since the hospital. "You always know how to disappear from the world," she said. "Maybe that's the secret to surviving it," he replied. That night they sat by the fireplace, the flames dancing like quiet memories. Sandra looked at him, her face soft in the glow. "You saved me, you know," she whispered. Keanu shook his head slowly. "You saved yourself." "I just reminded you how to fight," she smiled, her eyes glistening. "Then don't leave yet. I don't think I've learned how to live softer without you." He smiled faintly, his gaze steady on the fire. "Then I'll stay until you do." The night grew deeper, but neither of them felt the need to speak. Outside, the forest whispered against the windows, and the stars glowed faintly above the darkened hills. For the first time in a long while, Sandra felt safe. Not because the world was kind, but because someone had chosen to stay. She looked at him one last time before closing her eyes, her voice soft and sleepy. "Thank you for finding me before I got lost completely." Keanu leaned back, his expression unreadable, the faintest smile on his lips. "That's what friends are for," he said quietly, but in his heart, he knew it was something deeper, a bond that went beyond friendship, beyond fame, beyond time itself. As the fire crackled and the night wrapped around them, a quiet understanding passed between them, an unspoken promise that no matter what came next, neither of them would ever face it alone again. The cabin of quiet hearts. The days that followed moved slowly, like the rhythm of an old song that had forgotten the need to rush. The cabin stood nestled among tall pines and trembling birches, its wooden walls holding the scent of rain and warmth. Outside, the world seemed far away. No paparazzi, no scripts, no flashing lights, only the whisper of wind and the soft hum of life healing itself. For the first time in years, Sandra felt time stretched like a soft blanket rather than a tight leash around her neck. Each morning, she woke up to the sound of birds instead of alarms, and each night she fell asleep to the low crackle of the fire instead of the endless noise of city dreams. Keanu kept his promise. He was always around, quiet, steady, a presence that asked for nothing but gave everything. Sometimes she would find him sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, his gaze lost in the forest beyond, as though he was searching for something the rest of the world had long forgotten. On one such morning, she joined him wrapped in a light shawl, her hair still tousled from sleep. "You've changed," she said softly, sitting beside him. He turned his head, his eyes gentle but carrying a quiet sadness. "Maybe I just stopped pretending," he replied. "When you lose enough, you start to see what really matters." Sandra looked at him for a long moment. She had known about the tragedies that shaped him, the loss of the woman he loved, the child that never got to take its first breath, the loneliness that followed him like a shadow no camera could ever capture. But hearing it said so plainly, in that calm tone of acceptance, struck her deeper than she expected. "You talk about loss like it's an old friend," she whispered. Keanu smiled faintly. "Because it is. But you learn that grief doesn't end. It just changes shape. Some days it's a storm, other days it's a gentle rain. You learn to live with it. She listened quietly, her heart heavy and light all at once. And how do you do it? She asked. How do you wake up every day and still find kindness? He looked out at the trees, the sunlight touching the edge of his face. By remembering that every person is fighting something you can't see. I stopped judging the world the day I realized everyone's just trying to survive their pain. His words lingered in the air like incense, warm and sad at once. Sandra closed her eyes for a moment, breathing them in. She had spent so much of her life chasing perfection, the perfect performance, the perfect image, the perfect control. But sitting beside him, she realized how hollow that chase had become. She wasn't sure if she envied his peace or feared the depth it came from. Over the next few days, her strength began to return. She cooked small meals, walked in the garden, and even started writing again, not for a role, but for herself. Pages filled with words that came from somewhere raw and real, words she didn't know she still had. Keanu would often find her sitting by the fireplace, pen moving slowly, her expression distant but alive. "What are you writing?" he asked one evening. She smiled softly, not looking up. "Letters I never sent," she said. "To myself, to people I lost, to moments that never got to end properly." He nodded slowly, understanding more than he let on. "Sometimes the things we never say are the ones that heal us," he murmured. That evening, as rain began to fall outside, they sat by the fire again, two silhouettes framed by the soft glow of the flames. The rain tapped gently against the glass, and for a moment everything felt suspended, two souls in quiet repair. Sandra turned to him, her eyes thoughtful. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The chaos, the noise, the world we left behind?" He took a moment to answer, his voice low and honest. "Sometimes. But I think what I really miss is the illusion that if I worked hard enough, if I gave enough, maybe the world would love me back. But love doesn't come from the world, Sandy. It comes from the people who stay when everything else fades." She looked at him, her throat tight, her heart beating unevenly. "And you stayed," she whispered. He met her gaze and nodded slightly. "Because you would have done the same." The storm outside grew heavier, thunder rolling across the sky like a memory too loud to ignore. At one point, the lights flickered and went out, leaving the cabin wrapped in darkness. Keanu lit a few candles and set them on the table, their soft glow painting the room in amber light. Sandra laughed quietly. "It feels like we're living in another world," she said. He smiled, handing her a blanket. "Maybe we are. Maybe this is what the real world should look like." She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and stared into the dancing flame. "I used to think happiness was something you could earn," she admitted. "That if I worked hard enough, helped enough people, maybe I'd deserve peace. But now I think peace doesn't care about what we deserve. It just waits until we stop fighting." Keanu looked at her, his voice tender. "Maybe peace isn't found, Sandy. Maybe it's created in moments like this." The wind howled outside, but inside, the silence between them felt safe. She shifted closer, resting her head against his shoulder. He froze for a moment, not because he was surprised, but because the gesture felt so fragile, like touching a memory that could shatter if you breathed too loudly. "You don't have to hold everything together anymore," he said softly. "The world won't end if you fall apart for a while." She closed her eyes, the warmth of his voice grounding her. "Maybe I'm tired of being strong," she whispered. "Then be tired," he replied. "I'll hold the world for you for a while." That night, she cried quietly, not out of pain, but release. For the first time in years, she let herself break without shame. Keanu didn't try to stop her. He just stayed, his hand resting gently on her back, letting her tears fall freely. Outside, the storm eased into a drizzle, and inside, something shifted between them. Not romantic, not scripted, but profoundly human. Two people who had lost too much, finally learning that healing didn't always mean forgetting. Sometimes it simply meant being seen. By morning, the rain had stopped. The world outside the window looked washed clean, the sky painted with soft shades of gold and silver. Sandra stood by the door, holding a mug of coffee, watching the sun rise through the mist. Keanu joined her quietly. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It always is," he answered. "We just forget to look." She turned to him and smiled, not the practiced smile the world knew, but something real, unguarded. "I think I'm starting to remember," she said. He nodded, his expression calm and proud. "Good," he murmured, "because the world needs your light again, but only when you're ready." In that moment, surrounded by silence and sunrise, they both understood something simple yet profound. Healing wasn't about going back to who they were. It was about learning who they could become after surviving what they had. Sandra took a deep breath, feeling her heart steady for the first time in a long while. "You were right," she said softly. "About living softer," Keanu smiled gently. "It's not easy," he said, "but it's worth it." The cabin that once felt like a refuge had become something more, a sanctuary where two broken hearts remembered how to beat again, not perfectly, not painlessly, but honestly. And as they stood together, the sunlight touching their faces, neither of them said the words they both felt, that maybe, just maybe, the universe had brought them here not to escape life, but to start living it again. The world comes knocking again. By the time Sandra felt ready to leave the cabin, the forest around them had begun to shift into autumn, the air crisp and carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. The days had grown shorter, the sunsets more golden, as if time itself wanted to linger a little longer before letting go. She stood by the old wooden door, her fingers tracing the edge of the frame, and took a deep breath. It was strange, she thought, how this quiet place, once a hideaway from fear, had become the place where she learned how to breathe again. The city had always been her stage, her battlefield, her mirror. But here she had found something Hollywood could never give her. Peace that didn't need applause. Keanu watched her from across the room as she packed a few things into a small leather bag. His face was calm, though there was a flicker of worry in his eyes. He had seen this moment before. That fragile instant when a soul tries to return to the world after learning how to rest. "You don't have to rush," he said softly, breaking the silence. She turned and smiled faintly. "If I don't go now, I might never leave," she replied. He walked toward her slowly, hands in his pockets. "Maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing," he murmured. She looked at him, eyes tired but kind. "It would, Keanu, because we both know running from the world doesn't heal you. Facing it does." They drove back to Los Angeles in silence, the long winding roads giving them time to think without speaking. Sandra gazed out the window, the reflection of the passing trees blurring into the faint shadow of her own face. She thought of the hospital, of the white lights and whispered prayers, and then of the cabin where silence had given her back her strength. But most of all, she thought of the man sitting beside her, quiet, patient, steady as ever. He had seen her at her weakest and never once turned away. She wondered if she could ever repay that kind of loyalty. Keanu kept his focus on the road, the faint hum of the car filling the space between them. He wasn't good with words, not when they mattered most, but he wanted to tell her that she didn't owe him anything, that just seeing her smile again was enough. Still he stayed silent, because sometimes love, even the kind that hides behind friendship, is best expressed by staying near, not speaking loud. When they reached the city, the contrast hit them both like a wave. The noise, the traffic, the flashes of cameras near the gates of her home, everything she had forgotten came rushing back. As soon as she stepped out of the car, shouts erupted from across the street. Reporters were already there, their lenses hungry for a glimpse of her after weeks of speculation. "Sandra, are you okay? Is it true you collapsed from exhaustion? Are you and Keanu together?" The questions flew like arrows, sharp and careless. Sandra froze, her heart pounding, the world spinning too fast again. But before panic could take over, Keanu stepped in front of her, his tall frame shielding her from the chaos. "Enough," he said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "Give her space." There was something in his tone, not anger but authority, that made even the most aggressive photographers lower their cameras. He opened the car door again and guided her inside before the noise could reach her ears. For a long moment they just sat there breathing, listening to the muffled roar outside. "I forgot what this felt like," she whispered. "It's like the world doesn't let you live. It just watches you survive." Keanu turned to her and said gently, "Then let's remind them what living looks like." Over the next few weeks, Sandra began to return to her life piece by piece. She attended small meetings, met her team, and reconnected with her children. Her health improved, and her laughter slowly returned, softer, more genuine, not the polished sound that the world expected, but something truer. Yet she could still feel the shadow of fear behind every good day, the fear that it could all disappear again. Keanu visited her often, sometimes unannounced, always with small gestures that spoke volumes. He brought her favorite tea, fixed her leaky garden light, or just sat quietly on her porch while she read. Their friendship had become an anchor in a sea that often tried to pull her back into chaos. The media, of course, began to spin stories. Photos of them walking together filled the tabloids. Keanu's secret visits, Sandra's guardian angel, are they more than friends? She read the headlines and laughed sometimes. Though beneath that laughter, she knew that what they shared was something the world could never label correctly. It wasn't about romance, it was about recognition. Two weary hearts that found a home in each other's silence. One evening, she invited him to dinner at her house. It was a simple meal, soup, bread, and quiet music playing in the background. They talked about old films, about the absurdity of fame, about the strange comfort of growing older in a world that worshipped youth. At one point, she looked at him and said softly, "You know, they keep calling you my guardian angel." He smiled, eyes lowering to his plate. "That's not what I am," he said. "Then what are you?" she asked, curious. He lifted his gaze, and the faint candlelight flickered in his eyes. "Just someone who remembers who you really are when you forget." For a moment, neither spoke. There was a stillness in the air, not awkward but sacred, like the silence between the end of a song and the beginning of applause. Sandra reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand. "Then don't stop reminding me," she said quietly. He nodded, a faint smile curving his lips. "I won't." As months passed, life began to move forward again. Sandra returned to work, not with the same intensity as before, but with a new purpose. She started a foundation for mental health and wellness among actors and crew members, determined to help others avoid the silent burnout that nearly took her life. The first event she attended was quiet and elegant, held in a garden lit with soft white lights. As she stood before the audience, she felt a strange calm settle over her. Cameras flashed, faces watched, but this time she wasn't performing. She was sharing. "I used to believe that strength meant never stopping," she said into the microphone, her voice steady. "But the truth is, strength is sometimes knowing when to rest, when to ask for help, when to let yourself be human." The audience fell silent, many with tears in their eyes. Keanu, standing in the back, watched her with quiet pride. He didn't need to be in the spotlight. Just seeing her reclaim her light was enough. Later that night, when the event ended and the guests had gone, Sandra found him near the garden gate, leaning against a tree. She walked toward him, her heels clicking softly against the stone path. "You didn't say goodbye," she said, teasing gently. He smiled. "You didn't need me for that part. You did perfectly on your own." She looked at him for a long moment before saying, "I couldn't have gotten here without you." He shook his head slowly. "You were already here, Sandra. You just forgot how strong you were." She stepped closer, her voice almost a whisper. "Then maybe you reminded me just in time." For a moment, the air between them felt charged with something beyond words, gratitude, affection, perhaps something deeper that neither dared name. As they stood there beneath the soft glow of the garden lights, Keanu finally said quietly, "Promise me something." She tilted her head. "What?" "Promise me that next time you feel like you're breaking, you'll call someone, even if it's not me. Don't ever carry it alone again." Her eyes softened. "And you? Who do you call when it's you who's breaking?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe I just did." They stood in silence, the city lights flickering in the distance, the night air cooled against their faces. In that stillness, they didn't need to say anything more. The promise hung between them, fragile, invisible, but real. When she finally got home that night, Sandra stood before her mirror. For the first time in years, she didn't see the tired actress or the woman defined by her fame. She saw a survivor, someone who had faced her darkness and come out softer, kinder, stronger. On her dresser lay a small note in Keanu's handwriting that he must have slipped into her purse earlier. The world needs your light, but don't let it burn you. Shine gently. Okay, she smiled through her tears, holding the note close to her heart. That night, as she drifted to sleep, she realized something profound. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't written in confessions or kisses, but in quiet loyalty, in the way one person shows up when the world forgets to. And for Sandra and Keanu, that was enough. A bond stronger than fame, deeper than words, built on the simple, beautiful truth that even in the loudest world, the gentlest hearts always find each other again. When the strong become the fragile, the months passed quietly after Sandra's foundation took off, but the peace that had blossomed between her and Keanu began to shift in ways neither of them fully understood. Life had returned to its familiar rhythm, premieres, interviews, quiet dinners and long drives, but something unspoken hovered between them, something both comforting and heavy. Sandra had learned to live slower, to breathe more deeply, to treat her heart like the delicate instrument it was. Yet she noticed that Keanu, the man who once carried the calm of oceans in his eyes, seemed to be fading into quiet shadows again. He smiled less often, spoke more softly, and sometimes disappeared for days without a word. At first, she told herself that he just needed space, that solitude was his way of healing. But one evening, when she called and his phone went unanswered for the third time, something inside her refused to stay still. That night, Los Angeles was drenched in rain. The streets shimmered with reflections of red and white lights, and the city's noise softened beneath the storm. Sandra grabbed her coat, ignoring the protests of her assistant, and drove toward Keanu's home, the same small house tucked behind ivy-covered walls where he had always found his peace. The drive felt endless. Her fingers trembled slightly on the steering wheel, not from fear, but from a memory. The last time she had rushed into a hospital, desperate not to lose someone she loved in silence. When she finally arrived, she found his motorcycle parked in the driveway, wet from the rain, untouched for hours. She knocked once, then twice. No answer. "Keanu?" she called, her voice barely rising above the sound of the rain. Still nothing. She hesitated only for a moment before finding the spare key he had once given her, a quiet symbol of trust between two people who rarely needed words. Inside, the house was dark, except for a faint light spilling from the living room. She stepped inside carefully, her heart pounding, and found him sitting on the floor beside the couch, surrounded by open boxes, old photographs, letters, movie stills, mementos of a life that had known too much loss. He didn't look up right away, as if he hadn't even heard her come in. When he finally did, his eyes were tired, red-rimmed but calm. "Hey," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "You shouldn't be out in the rain." Sandra stood there for a moment, her chest tightening. "I called," she said quietly. "You didn't answer." He gave a small, weary smile. "Didn't want to make you worry." "You failed," she replied, kneeling down beside him. For a long time, neither spoke. She looked at the scattered pieces of his past, a photo of his late girlfriend, a letter written in faded ink, a pair of baby shoes wrapped in tissue. The weight of his silence pressed against the air like a living thing. "You found your ghosts," she whispered. "They never left," he said. Sandra reached out and touched one of the photographs, a younger Keanu, smiling in a way she had never seen him smile in real life. "You've carried them for too long," she murmured. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You can't bury love, Sandra. It stays, it just changes shape." She felt tears burn behind her eyes. "Then let me carry some of it with you," she said. "You've carried enough alone." He didn't respond immediately, but she saw the faintest tremor in his hands. "You already have," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Every time you laughed again. Every time you didn't give up. The words broke her. She leaned forward, wrapping her arms around him. For a moment he didn't move, as if afraid the gesture might shatter the fragile peace holding him together. But then, slowly he returned the embrace, resting his forehead against her shoulder. Neither cried loudly. They just breathed, two survivors finding shelter in the same storm. Later that night they sat together by the small fire he had lit, both wrapped in silence. The rain outside softened to a whisper, and the flames flickered across their faces like gentle confessions. "You know," Sandra said quietly, "I always thought you were the unbreakable one." Keanu chuckled softly, the sound more breath than laughter. "No one's unbreakable, Sandy. Some of us just learn how to break quietly." She turned to him, eyes glistening in the firelight. "You shouldn't have to do it alone anymore." He met her gaze, something raw and unguarded flickering there. "And you shouldn't have to be the strong one all the time either," he said. "We can share the weight." The following morning, she insisted he come with her to a retreat her foundation had organized in the countryside, a place where artists, actors and everyday people came to heal, to talk, to remember that pain didn't have to be hidden. He resisted at first, but her persistence softened him. When they arrived, the hills stretched endlessly under a clear blue sky, and the air smelled of lavender and new beginnings. Sandra watched as Keanu walked along the quiet paths, his shoulders relaxing, his expression lighter with every step. That evening, during a small fireside gathering, she spoke about him without saying his name, about the quiet strength of those who help others heal even while carrying invisible wounds themselves. The people around the fire listened, moved, and when she glanced at Keanu, she saw a single tear tracing his cheek. It was the first time she had seen him cry, not from pain, but from release. Days passed gently. They talked for hours under open skies, sometimes about everything, sometimes about nothing at all. She told him about her fears, of losing herself again, of being consumed by fame and expectation. He told her about his guilt, the kind that never fully left after losing those he loved. "Maybe that's what love is," she said softly one night as they watched the stars. "Carrying someone even after they're gone." Keanu nodded, his voice calm. "And maybe healing is learning that carrying doesn't mean drowning." On their last night at the retreat, Sandra found a letter on her pillow in Keanu's handwriting. "Thank you for reminding me that light doesn't only come from the sky. Sometimes it comes from people who refuse to stop believing you deserve it." She folded it carefully, holding it to her chest. When she stepped outside, he was sitting by the fire again, staring into the flames. She sat beside him, the silence stretching comfortably between them. "You could have told me in person," she teased softly. He smiled. "Some things sound better on paper. And some things," she said, "are better felt." She reached over and took his hand. He didn't pull away. They sat like that for a long time. No declarations, no promises, just presence. The kind of love that didn't need a label, because it lived quietly in the spaces between words. The moon rose high above the hills, and in its silver light, their shadows merged on the ground. Two lives that had walked through storms and found, at last, a place to rest. When they returned to the city days later, the cameras would follow again, the world would talk again, and life would try to pull them back into its endless spin. But something had changed. They had seen each other's fragility, and instead of running from it, they chose to stay. For Sandra, it meant strength reborn. For Keanu, it meant peace rediscovered. And for both, it meant that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories aren't about falling in love, but about learning how to stay when the other person finally falls apart. The world finally saw. The morning sun spilled across the skyline of Los Angeles, brushing the glass towers with gold, but the day carried a tension the city could feel. After months of quiet healing, Sandra and Keanu were about to appear together in public for the first time since her collapse and his silent disappearance. The event was grand, the annual Global Heart Foundation Gala, where Sandra would be honored for her humanitarian work and her resilience after recovery. Yet beyond the speeches and the cameras, everyone knew this moment would be different. The world had watched them through headlines and whispers, through the unspoken story that had lived behind every photo, the story of loyalty, healing, and something deeper that no one could quite name. And as the city prepared, Sandra stood before her mirror, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the final clasp of her dress. She looked radiant, but not in the polished way of movie stars. Her beauty that night came from something quieter, peace earned through pain, light softened by forgiveness. Keanu arrived quietly, as he always did. No entourage, no drama, just a simple black suit, his hair tied back, his expression calm. When Sandra opened the door, he smiled, that small, genuine curve of his lips that never needed words. "You look like yourself again," he said softly. She laughed under her breath, brushing away a stray tear. "And you look like someone who still refuses to wear a tie," he shrugged lightly. Some things never change. There was comfort in that, the familiar humor that always steadied her nerves. For a moment, they just stood there, looking at each other, and it felt as though the world had paused. The months of pain, recovery, and quiet companionship had built something sacred between them, not bound by romance, but by an unspoken truth that ran deeper than love. The gala hall shimmered with light, filled with familiar faces, expensive laughter, and the hum of polite admiration. But as Sandra and Keanu entered together, a hush rippled through the crowd. Every camera turned, every whisper held its breath. For once, it wasn't about fame or gossip, it was about awe. There was something disarmingly human about them, standing side by side, not posing, but simply being. Sandra took a deep breath as she stepped onto the stage later that night. The applause thundered through the hall, but she didn't rush to speak. She let the silence settle, allowed the emotion to fill the room before she began. "A few months ago," she said, her voice steady yet soft, "I thought I had lost myself. I thought that strength meant never falling. But then I learned, sometimes strength means allowing someone to catch you when you do." The audience listened in complete stillness. Every eye followed her as she turned slightly, looking toward Keanu, who stood quietly at the edge of the stage, hands folded, his gaze steady. "This man," she continued, her voice trembling slightly, "reminded me that kindness doesn't need an audience, that love, in its purest form, doesn't demand to be seen. It simply stays." Her words hung in the air like a hymn. Cameras flashed, but the image they captured wasn't one of Hollywood glamour. It was of two souls who had walked through fire and found grace on the other side. After the speech, the room erupted in applause, not polite or rehearsed, but genuine, raw emotion from people who had forgotten that even stars could break and rebuild. Keanu met her at the bottom of the steps, his eyes shining, not from pride but from understanding. "You did it," he whispered. She smiled faintly. "No," she said, "we did." They didn't need to say more. The look they shared was enough to tell the world what words couldn't, that sometimes the truest connections are the quietest ones. But the night wasn't done testing them. As the event ended and the crowd spilled into the open courtyard, the press surged forward like a tide. Questions flew through the air. "Are you together? Keanu, how did you save her? Sandra, what are you to each other now?" The chaos threatened to swallow the serenity they had built. Sandra froze for a moment, flashes burning her eyes, until Keanu gently took her hand, not for show, but out of instinct. The crowd gasped. The cameras flashed brighter, but he didn't flinch. "We're human," he said calmly to the nearest microphone. "We've both seen what loss looks like. So when you find someone who helps you remember life again, you hold on. You don't label it, you just hold on." The words silenced even the loudest voices. For once, the world didn't have a scandal to sell. It had a story to feel. In the days that followed, the moment spread everywhere. News outlets replayed his words, calling them the speech that redefined love. But neither Sandra nor Keanu gave any interviews. They didn't need to explain what the world had already seen in their eyes. Instead, they retreated once more into quiet, not isolation but peace. Sandra continued her foundation work, mentoring young actors, visiting hospitals, and speaking about mental health. Keanu joined her on several occasions, not as a star, but as a silent supporter, helping where needed, often unnoticed. Sometimes, during long drives after an event, they would sit in his car by the ocean, watching the waves crash against the shore. "You ever think about how strange it is," Sandra would say, "that two broken people could somehow fix each other?" Keanu would smile faintly, his gaze on the horizon. "Maybe we didn't fix each other," he'd reply. "Maybe we just reminded each other that broken doesn't mean unworthy." Years passed, but their bond remained untouched by time. There were no declarations, no public confessions, just presence. Sometimes weeks would pass without a word, and then one of them would call, and it would feel as though no time had passed at all. The world kept guessing, kept spinning stories, but they lived beyond it. Their friendship became a quiet legend, proof that not all great love stories end with romance, that some end with understanding. One crisp winter morning, Sandra visited the old cabin again. It was just as they had left it, the same wooden walls, the same whisper of wind through the pines. She stood on the porch, wrapped in her coat, a faint smile touching her lips as memories returned. After a while, she heard soft footsteps behind her. "Didn't think you'd come without me," Keanu said gently. She turned and laughed, her eyes glistening. "You think I'd face this silence alone?" He joined her on the porch, standing beside her as they looked out at the forest. The air was still, almost sacred. "It all started here," she said quietly. "The breaking and the healing," he nodded. "It's funny," he murmured. "The world saw you collapse, but it never knew I was the one who needed saving too." She looked at him, her voice soft. "Maybe we saved each other." He smiled, the wind catching his hair. "Maybe that's all any of us ever do." They stayed there until the sun began to set, the golden light wrapping around them like a blessing. No cameras, no applause, no audience, just two souls who had weathered the storm and learned to live softer together. When they finally turned to leave, Sandra took one last look at the cabin, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you think the world will ever understand what we had?" Keanu paused, then said quietly, "It doesn't have to." "We do," as they walked down the narrow path toward the car. The first snow of the season began to fall, slow and silent, covering their footprints as if the world itself wanted to preserve their story, not in headlines but in memory. And somewhere between the falling snow and the fading light, it became clear that theirs wasn't a story about love lost or love found. It was about love endured, the kind that doesn't burn bright and fast, but stays like a quiet flame, keeping two hearts warm through the long winters of life. For Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, the world had always been loud, but in the end, it was the silence, the shared, sacred silence, that told their story best.